Okay, great to be here. I'm really happy we're doing this workshop and getting a discussion going on how to bring all these different perspectives together. You might know that there is a new conference, Cognitive Computational Neuroscience, which started a couple of years ago, which has a lot of the same themes of bringing cognitive science together with computational neuroscience and sort of invading this higher level of how the mind models the world with computational models and also data from behavior and from the brain. So my title is Letting Mental Models Emerge, and that's a little bit of an ambitious title, so we're not really there yet. This is more of a workshop talk where I want to sort of start a discussion about our perspective on what we want to do in the next few years. And this is, from my perspective, not the best approach necessarily. It's all very much a pragmatic choice. You have to focus on something. And I see it as complementary to some of the more top-down and cognitive approaches that some people here pursue. So I love the title of this meeting, The Brain Produces the Mind by Modeling. And you could say by modeling the world. Rich had a long list of different things that entails, but let's leave it at the world. So what does this mean for us who want to model the brain and the mind? Well, I think you could look at it from two perspectives. You could say, well, if the brain produces the mind by modeling the world, maybe we want to model the world and then look for those models in the mind and the brain. And another approach would be to model the brain and then let the mind's models emerge. And so you could imagine these two meeting in the middle, and I think they should meet in the middle. They're very much complementary, and that's what we're here for. But of course, pragmatically, we have to sort of focus on something. So in my lab, we're more taking the bottom-up perspective. So let's think a little bit more in detail about computational models of brain function. I think of them in terms of this two-dimensional space of biologically motivated complexity that you build into the model and cognitively motivated complexity that you build in. So along this biologically motivated axis, you have the Hodgkin and Huxley model of action potential generation, more complex single neuron models with multiple compartments, and also these big network models that attempt to simulate the biology in great detail and can give rise to neural population dynamics and oscillations and things like that. And then along the cognitive axis, you have these models in cognitive science, which are brain information processing models, which can actually perform tasks. And what's a little bit depressing, what's always been depressing to me about this is that it seems as though when you set out to model the biology, you get the biology, but you get no task performance. You get no interesting brain information processing. And when you model the brain information processing or the cognitive processes, then you're sort of divorced from the biology, and it's difficult to relate those models or test those models with the increasingly rich brain activity data that we can acquire in humans and animals today. So for me, the most interesting models historically and also today are in the space between these. And so an example would be the Gabor wavelet model, which is conceptually consistent with the biology, but also makes a lot of sense from an engineering perspective and can be derived, it can emerge by optimizing a representation, for example, in terms of reconstruction error or constraints such as sparsity. So still, when we look at this, there's this depressing trade-off here between the two. But I think, and maybe I hope more than think, but I think there's some reason to hope that this trade-off can turn into a synergy where when we push along one of these axes, we also get further along another axis. And I think the successive convolutional feed-forward models boring as they are to many of us at this point, they're kind of the new null model from my perspective. They are an example of taking inspiration from biology and then beating everything in engineering. So, and I think that's just the first step. I think we're going to see more along this direction. So there's this bottom-up approach and the top-down approach, and I would like to submit that we should combine these two and go through the middle here and try to think about the relationship between the information processing and the dynamics in the brain and be inspired in terms of our algorithms by the brain. So where is all of this going? I think it must be going to some sort of target here for a given task. So that would be, we need to, so all of this implies that we're carving up human cognition by defining tasks that make cognition measurable and that make behavior objectively measurable and comparable between models and organisms. And for a given complex task, I would expect that this development here leads us to models that are very high parametric, more so than in the past in the cognitive and brain sciences. And that's just because AI requires a lot of world knowledge. And so if we want to explain intelligence, we need to swallow the bitter pill that the models are going to be complex. But that doesn't mean we can't have a conceptual understanding of the models. So I'm going to have two parts to my talk. The first one is about feed-forward neural network models, and the second one is about recurrent neural network models. And the second one takes a little sort of initial steps toward simulating processes that could be thought of as involving models. But I would say that hasn't happened yet, right? But it's something that we're very, very interested in exploring. So here are some established results that I think are good to review. Feed-forward networks predict visual object representations in inferior temporal cortex. So here I'm showing you the accuracy with which we can predict the representation in human inferior temporal cortex, which is a high-level object representation, which is sort of a visual semantic representation. And when we use a deep convolutional feed-forward network and then compare the representational spaces, as we go up the layers of this model, we explain more and more variance. And by using weighted combinations of the layers and readout filters that are optimized for categories and fitted with separate sets of images, we can get quite close to what we call the noise ceiling, which is the range in which we would expect the true data generating process to fall in terms of predictive power, given the noise in the data and the intersubject variability. So we're not explaining all the variance here, but we're kind of getting close. But of course, need to keep in mind that how high this noise ceiling is a reflection of the quality of our data set. So if we got a better data set, for example, more data or more images, then we'd expect the noise ceiling to go up and we'd be more sensitive to the remaining discrepancies. So these models, I think, explain, they're sort of real in that they explain a component of what's going on in the visual stream, and essentially it's the feed-forward sweep of processing. When you open your eyes, or I switch on an image on a gray screen, and then within the next 100 to 150 milliseconds, the activity spreads through the visual hierarchy. So these kinds of computations are somewhat captured by these models. So many labs have seen that now. Here's an example from Dan Yamens's work with Jim DiCarlo, where they predicted responses of IT neurons to lots of different images. And you see that the model is very good at predicting responses of a single cell here to new images after having been fit with different images. People also see that the deep net layers correspond to stages of the ventral visual stream. Here's an example from our lab. We saw that early visual areas are best explained by these earlier layers of a deep convolutional neural net, and the lateral occipital complex, which is more category selective, is best explained by these higher layers. Here's an example from Marcel van Gerwen's lab where they mapped out the best explaining layer across a cortical flat map. So here you see the left and the right hemisphere. These are the visual areas, V1, V2, V3, and LO. And the colors encode which layer of a deep convolutional feed-forward network best explained each voxel in this fMRI data set. So we see this gradual transformation, which also matches between these feed-forward models and brains. And that's an important finding because these models are, of course, trained with supervision. So they're trained to classify. They're trained to produce categorical representations. And even before these findings kept popping up, we knew from the human imaging literature and also from monkey recording literature that responses in IIT are highly categorical, right? So it's important to see that it's not only sort of this categorical component that these models can predict, but also sort of the stages of transformation and the representational spaces. Here's some ongoing work from Jan Scharre, who was a postdoc in my lab in Cambridge and is now a lecturer at the University of Birmingham. And he asked whether categorization reaction times of humans for particular objects can be predicted from the IIT representation and from deep convolutional neural network representations. So he had people categorize object images along different categorical divisions. I'm only going to show you animate versus inanimate categorization. So for each of these particular images, we have a reaction time, and this is the mean reaction time across participants here. And then we're trying to use these models to predict this profile of reaction times, where we're trying to explain from exactly what the image is, how long it takes to respond in a categorization task like that. We're using these representational readout models where we might have, for example, a linear discriminant for some categorical division, and this gives us a decision value, and we interpret that decision value, which measures how far from the decision boundary that particular image is in the representational space. We interpret that as sort of the strength of the signal for a particular category. So we assume that that determines the evidence accumulation rate and then the reaction time. So you can also generalize this framework a little bit by replacing the linear kernel here with some more general similarity kernel, for example, a radio basis function kernel. And this allows us to sort of go back to the cognitive science literature on categorization and bring some of these ideas into this literature and try to predict reaction times from deep neural networks. I'm only going to show you a linear readout result. So here's a more intuitive version of what we're doing here. So we have this high-dimensional representational space, which I'm plotting here in a 2D dimensionality reduction that was produced with multidimensional scaling. Then we fit in the high-dimensional space this category readout, and this gives us the decision value for each of these particular images. And then we can plot for a given brain representation like IT that we've measured with fMRI, or for a model representation, and this is what I'm showing you here, the decision value. So here's the decision boundary, and things that are close to the boundary would fall here, and things that are far from the boundary would be in the periphery here. And we expect that the things that are close to the boundary are more difficult to discriminate and might take longer to discriminate, so we expect higher reaction times here in the middle. And here's what we actually see for the set of images. when I color code them, it's pretty clear that you see that most of the images are correctly classified, and the ones that have higher decision values are the ones that humans more quickly categorize. So from my perspective, this is a somewhat converging story about the feed-forward neural networks of higher-level vision. They partially explain how the initial sweep through the primate visual hierarchy enables recognition at a glance. They predict representations of novel images and behavioral performance better than alternative current models. And I haven't shown you this, but both the architecture of the model and the task training contribute substantially to these successes. However, we need to build models whose architecture more closely resembles the visual hierarchy, because these models are really only inspired by biology at a very conceptual level. They don't correspond, for example, one by one layer to area. And also in terms of the connectivity structure, they're not realistic. So a major way that they fall short is that they don't contain recurrent connections. And recurrent connections are ubiquitous in the visual system and produce a much richer space of network models that is a very interesting modeling framework where the model produces ongoing dynamics and lends itself to analyzing and generating spatiotemporal patterns. So it can, for example, perceive video. It can dynamically compress the recent stimulus history to remember context that it might need for interpreting the incoming information. And it also can produce dynamic sequences of outputs as needed for control. So this puts us in a much more interesting modeling framework, both from the perspective of engineering, where recurrent neural networks have a long history and are state-of-the-art in a number of applications, and also in terms of being more realistic about the biology. So Courtney Spura, a PhD student in my lab in Cambridge, who's just finishing his thesis, asked whether recurrent convolutional neural networks provide better models of vision. So Courtney wanted to do something that's very consistent with the kinds of feed-forward convolutional models that we've been working with, and just adds the recurrence while keeping a lot of the sort of good features of feed-forward convolutional models. So he said, let's keep the convolutional aspect of these models, let's keep the hierarchical layer structure, and let's just make this one little change that we're adding lateral connections and top-down connections. So this gives rise to an interesting space of architectures that I'm going to take you through now. So this is the classical architecture, which we call B for bottom-up, feed-forward convolutional neural network. In this architecture, each unit in a layer sees a restricted receptive field in the layer below. So all these layers are sort of spatial retinotopic maps of the image. And a key aspect of this convolutional neural net framework that many of you might be familiar with is that each unit sees a restricted receptive field. And that's inspired by vision, of course, where neurons in V1 and V2 and other retinotopic visual areas also have restricted visual receptive fields. So they respond to stimuli in a particular small part of the visual field. So this is the B architecture. We can add lateral connections. So this is the BL architecture, and that's a recurrent convolutional neural network. So now each unit in a layer listens not only to what it gets from the layer below, but also to its neighbors in the same layer, and both from the same feature map and across feature maps. But it's still a convolutional neural network in that this little weight template here is automatically generalized across all these spatial positions. And that means that the number of parameters to be learned is much smaller because we're using all the parameters we're learning in one location automatically in all locations, or maybe a better way of saying it is that we're learning at all locations together and then also using the features that we're learning at all locations. And finally, here's the BLT, convolutional recurrent architecture, where this unit is now sandwiched between the bottom-up and the top-down and the lateral connections. And again, this top-down weight template is also generalized across positions automatically. So we tried this first with some toy tasks. The first one we call digit debris, where Courtney hid each of these digits under a lot of little pieces of other digits. And this task was designed to be maximally hard for feed-forward neural networks, which look at the image in these little pieces and then essentially linearly combine the evidence for different patterns and are thought to rely heavily on texture information. So this is something that would be expected to confuse a feed-forward convolutional network a lot. Here the target digit is a 3, and you see that it's here, but it's not very easy to see. Here the target digit is a 1. And we found that the recurrent architectures, both BT, BL, and BLT, significantly outperformed the feed-forward architectures. What is plotted here is a classification error, so the less the better. And when we increased the amount of debris, the differences here became even more striking. We also tried another task called digit clutter, where we had lots of little digits on top of each other, and the task is to recognize all of them. So here you're supposed to say 2, 3, 5. And it's an interesting task because you might recognize things in different orders depending on how much of the digits is occluded, but also depending on how distinctive the features that are still visible are. And as we increase the number of digits, so for 5 digits, this task becomes harder and harder. And in this task as well, and across these different levels of difficulty, recurrent neural networks outperformed the feed-forward networks. So if you compare these bars here, these arrows within each of the difficulty levels tend to be smaller and significantly smaller for the recurrent convolutional architectures. Courtney then asked whether recurrent convolutional networks can be scaled up to process natural images. So he used a range of different architectures to compare the recurrent convolutional architecture and a bigger version than used on this previous toy task on the ImageNet recognition challenge and another slightly more ecologically valid test set, which we call the eco set, where the distribution of the different categories is better matched to a natural distribution. So he had these 3 feed-forward control models, BK, BF, and BD, which were approximately matched in their numbers of parameters, either by using broader features, so the kernels are bigger, the weight templates, the receptor fields are a little bit bigger, or more features in each layer, so more feature maps, or more layers. So here you have twice as many layers, so you have a deeper feed-forward network as a control model, but approximately matched in the total number of parameters. When we trained these kinds of models on ImageNet and EcoSet, we started to inspect these the lateral connectivity templates that they learn. And interestingly, they seem broadly consistent with what is known about lateral connectivity in primate V1. And this is sort of an ongoing exploration where I'd love to discuss, if people have expertise on this, what we should be comparing there exactly. In terms of raw performance, the recurrent convolutional networks outperformed the feed-forward networks, but not by a lot. So this seems to be a significant difference here, but on ImageNet, it's only a slight increase. Note also that the performance here is not totally state-of-the-art, and that's because we're not building very big models to sort of push the state-of-the-art in performance, but rather we want to understand how different architectures compare to each other. So we're training larger numbers of architectures, and therefore that restricts us to architectures that are a little bit smaller and where we're more nimble with the training and comparison. An interesting aspect of these models is that they can trade off accuracy for speed as humans can. So the output is what's known as a softmax, which can be interpreted as a probability distribution across the classes. They're not doing sort of proper probabilistic inference on some generative model, but nevertheless, in a feed-forward manner, they're mapping onto an output that can be interpreted as a probability distribution. And this enables us to set an entropy threshold where we use the entropy to measure the uncertainty of the network at every point in time. And then we can say when the probability mass concentrates sufficiently for the entropy to dip below some threshold, then we say we terminate computation. Now the network is sufficiently confident, and we use the answer it gives at that point. So when we do that, then for each entropy threshold of the recurrent model, which is shown as a line here, we can determine the computational cost. So this is the number of floating point operations, but it's also proportional to the time it took to compute the answer. So in other words, we can terminate computation very early and get low accuracy, or we can compute for a longer period and get a higher accuracy. And interestingly, this curve for the recurrent convolutional neural net model passes through the points that correspond to these inflexible feed-forward control models, right? So these are the feed-forward control models. This is the one with the twice the depth. So this is the deepest one of them. And all this can do is sort of take the input and process it to the output and output some answer, but it's not flexible in terms of what it can do. And if you restrict the recurrent feed-forward model to the same number of computations, then it performs about as well as the feed-forward model, but you can let the recurrent model compute longer, and then it outperforms the feed-forward model. So this is very interesting to us because it's a feature and an important feature of human recognition, this flexibility that we can be quicker, we can respond quickly at lower accuracy, or we can think longer and give better answers. So we're beginning to compare the particular images that our recurrent convolutional network found easy, that it rapidly responds to, or hard to ratings of humans in terms of their certainty in classification. And eventually also we don't have these data yet to reaction times of humans. So here's some initial results on the correlation between human certainty and the recurrent convolutional network's reaction time. We find that they're significantly correlated. So the RCNN reaction times tend to be slower for images that humans are more uncertain about. Tim Kietzmann in the lab asked the question whether recurrent neural network models capture the representational dynamics in the human ventral stream. So he looked at the set of stimuli presented to humans while they underwent MEG, magnetoencephalography, which has very high temporal resolution, but not very high spatial resolution. And he used source reconstruction to sort of disentangle the MEG signals into 3 buckets corresponding roughly to early visual cortex, intermediate visual processing, and higher level IT PHC visual processing. So this inverse problem in MEG is a very difficult problem, and it's hard to be sure whether the activity localization that you get is really reliable. However, in this case, we don't care about exactly localizing with millimeter precision where the activity was or what the activity pattern looked like. We just have this highly multivariate signal, and we're using a minimum norm estimate based on cortex surface reconstructions just to disentangle this multivariate signal into these three buckets or roughly corresponding to different levels of representation in the visual hierarchy. So here I'm going to show you now the representational dissimilarity matrices as movies. So these matrices that I haven't introduced you to yet have the stimuli along the vertical and the horizontal. So these are the same. This is a list of all the stimuli, and here's all the stimuli listed again. And you can look up in each location of this matrix how dissimilar two stimuli are in the representation, so how distinct or discriminable they are. Right? And this is the color code. And here it looks very noisy because it is noisy at the moment because we're at time step 0, so there's no information about the stimuli yet. And here I'm showing you two other representations, visualizations of the representational space. And these are MDS visualizations where the distance between 2 points, every point corresponds to a stimulus, and the distance reflects the discriminability of the two stimuli, or the distance in the representational space. So I'm going to show you this as a movie, and it's 100 times slowed down. So you can see sort of structure emerge after about 50 milliseconds, where the faces, this little red cluster, start becoming separate. And then later in time, when there has been quite a lot of time for recurrent processing, between 100 and 300 milliseconds, more structure emerges, especially here, categorical structure in these higher level representational spaces. So we're very excited about this because even though we don't see the single neurons here and we have very limited spatial resolution, we get a rich and dynamic picture of the computations that should give us some power to adjudicate among different dynamic models of the processing as well. So this goes on until 600 milliseconds, I believe. So that's ample time for recurrent processing in the ventral stream. We can look at this in a sort of data-driven way where we're looking for particular categories in the representations as a function of time. So here's when the stimulus was on. And now here we're correlating the RDM movie with this reference matrix, which looks for points in time where all the animates are clustered together. And the different colors here, you have the different ROIs. So you see that this animacy becomes very prominent after about 150 milliseconds. So that's dominated by the feed-forward sweep, but there's already some recurrent processing coming in. And it's much weaker in these earlier regions of interest at this early time point. And then, intriguingly, this completely collapses around 200 milliseconds. And then this animacy cluster reappears in this intermediate ROI and is even stronger than in the IT ROI, even though it reappears in all of them. So this is, I think, very hard to reconcile with the idea that this slightly longer scale dynamics is well accounted for by a feed-forward model. We're struggling to understand what happened there, and it's not completely trivial to be sure that there might not be artifacts of the source localization, but I think there's something interesting here that we need to get to the bottom of. Can also look for semantic features. Here's real-world size for Thalia. So here you see that this is quite strong in the IT ROI, around 150 milliseconds, and then kind of goes on and off and has a second sort of high peak here at about 250 milliseconds. So you could imagine that there's some higher level semantic processing going on there. So an important challenge is to use dynamic neural network models to try to explain these data and to use the data to adjudicate between competing dynamic models. So what we've done so far is to fit the model representational dynamics with deep representational distance learning. So this is an approach where we use these RDM movies to directly train recurrent and feed-forward neural network models to match the dynamics. And we use these movies from the MEG to insert error, to drive error flow at these predefined levels of the hierarchy of this recurrent convolutional model. So when we look at the movies for this model, and I'm going to show you two models here. So here's the V4LO area from the human MEG. Here's the BLT recurrent convolutional network. And here's a feed-forward control network, which we call a ramping feed-forward model, which is essentially a feed-forward model, but it has the ability to ramp up its activity gradually in order to create sort of a minimal kind of dynamic, which already predicts some nonlinear effects. So it's a more conservative control model. So when we look at this, we see that with the BLT model, we can capture these richer dynamics, whereas the B model is dynamic in the very beginning, but then converges pretty quickly, even when it's trained to sort of fit these data. And we see that the recurrent models do much better than the feed-forward models at explaining these representational distance matrix movies when they're trained and tested on separate sets of images. So the emerging recurrent story is that recurrent neural networks provide a more neurobiologically realistic and computationally powerful modeling framework. Recurrent processing can enable a network to use time to recycle its limited computational resources, to trade off speed and accuracy, and also to perform more robust inferences. Recurrent models also better explain the representational dynamics of the human ventral stream. But of course, these are only first steps, and future work should explore the much richer dynamic repertoire that biological brains offer, right? So the whole literature of neuroscience, I think, is very richly inspiring, and there's lots of theories that haven't really been tested in terms of their power to contribute to the information processing. So I think it's very exciting to work at the intersection between the engineering and the neuroscience there. So I think in the bigger picture, what we should do at this workshop is to think about the different literatures, including the behavioral phenomena, the cognitive theories and concepts, and the neural network mechanisms that have already been explored. And there's a really rich and exciting literature on models that include recurrence and try to tackle a lot of these higher level processes and attempts to let models emerge or build models into neural networks. And I think, in the next few years, and maybe starting at this workshop, we should start to link these different literatures. Thank you very much.